Cut their test ship off the corridor before it reaches Junction 7, Voss Calder ordered, his voice carrying across the command deck as the clamps beneath his boots jolted and the station shivered like an overstretched cable. Route surplus current into the bypass loops and keep the north chain intact, even if it costs us the cargo block. The heads-up displays draped vector lines over the viewport, while the laser plasma panels washed the scene in vivid geometry, icons for every contact, numbers for momentum, warnings for stress. The Serekan scout nosed into the corridor as though daring the tether to resist, arrogant as their earlier transmission that ridiculed Earth's toy rocks. The air tasted of stale coffee mixed with the sour tang of compressor oil. Heated plastic from the consoles gave off a biting smell that clung to the tongue. A stray flake of dried sealant floated near Calder's cheek, spinning in the conditioned draft like an uninvited thought, while the floor's vibration crept up his legs and settled in his chest. Deke Lorne strapped into his tug cradle and keyed his throat mic, each clipped word carrying the confidence of a man used to pushing heavy loads with brute control. Calder, collar team is staged. Charge levels along the corridor are climbing. That thing wants to test our spine. Let's show them the bite. The tug's rails cycled with a rattle that rolled through the canopy, and Lorne drummed his gloved fingers against the attitude stick as paint chips bounced across the glass like sparks in a forge. Give me the green and we'll leash it. Nolan Price, shoulders rigid at Foundry Fire Control, moved targeting bars with a tired sharpness, his eyes bloodshot from too many hours locked on telemetry. Drones on approach, he announced. Buckets of tungsten, straight line spread. Give me 30 seconds and I'll make their shots scatter like gravel. Bram Oak, bent over a bench behind Calder, held annotated sheets scrawled with numbers, corners blackened by coffee stains. His voice came steady, stripped of ornament. Induction envelope looks good. Their drive protection should trigger at 40% spike. That's the point where Lorne has 4 seconds to close. Calder's gaze fixed on the scout's telemetry, the pulse of its coils shining like a beacon to anyone trained to see weakness. Beneath his console, a slim folder pressed against his knee. The accident report from the day his brother had died when a tether had snapped and compartments had collapsed faster than backup systems could breathe. The paper was worn from being opened too often. The ink faded where his thumb had rubbed each page. Every choice since had been shaped by that loss, and now he was being tested again. The collective's first slice had already forced him to cut free a cargo block with men still inside, their beacons now blinking across the dark like stranded flares. He could picture them cramped in, suits jaws clenched against sour air, whispering through comms to keep each other awake while their fingers stiffened inside gloves. He had promised himself he would not let another failure become anonymous data in a report. The corridor's charge climbed, humming through the tether like blood forced through a vein under strain. Workers along the maintenance rung braced at handholds, boots scraping, belts clinking with tools, the rasp of fabric sharp in the tense air. One man cursed as a spanner slipped and clattered into a grate, the sound too loud in the pressurized cabin. Calder's jaw clenched at the reminder that the line between routine engineering and outright battle was as thin as the tether they were defending. Okay, lean closer, voice low. Envelope stable. Spike coming soon? Calder nodded without turning. Hold fire until the drop shows. If the spike doesn't stall them, they'll slide through and we'll look like fools. Then it came, a surge across the readings, coil temperature spiking, thrust dipping as protective circuits throttled back. Now, Calder snapped. Lorne's tug bolted forward, the magnetic clamps unfolding like jaws hungry for steel. The collar spun and streaked across the scout's path, ion trails streaking blue as they curved and closed. The Serekan pilot fought to press forward, but the drive's own safeguards betrayed him, current chasing back through circuits never meant for it. The collar locked with a resonant crack, and the chains swallowed the vessel's momentum, bleeding it into the tether and down into Earth's field. The scout's graceful glide stuttered into an unwilling drift, caught like prey in a net. Load holding, OK confirmed, his eyes alive as the numbers stabilized. Lorne grunted over comms, straining at controls. Collar seated. Their coils are bleeding energy. They push harder and they'll fry themselves. Price spat a laugh through clenched teeth. Escort drones closing. Let's keep them from spraying Lorne with nails. His fingers danced over firing triggers, and the rails answered with deep vibrations that rattled teeth. Countermass hissed out in carefully mapped streams, forming invisible walls. Tungsten pellets raced in, struck the foam barrier, and fizzled into nothing more than hot fragments that bounced harmlessly away. Price muttered, almost conversational, "Homework graded." Calder exhaled, though the taste in his mouth was bitter, as metal cups left too long unwashed. The station shook under redistributed loads, cables contracting and relaxing like muscle. "Rescue the cargo crews we dropped," he said. "They held their ground so we could ride this test. We don't leave them waiting any longer than physics requires." He lifted his eyes to the viewport where the Scout now sagged inside the tether's grip. Hull stress gleaming in rainbow arcs. The Saracen pilot had sent a burst to his fleet already. Mockery turned into embarrassment, weakness revealed in numbers instead of boasts. Calder straightened, his shoulders square. "Send word across the arc," he ordered. "Tell them capture is possible. Tell them our chains remember who cuts them. Keep staring at that captured Scout and you'll forget what's coming," Nolan Price muttered, leaning back in his seat while light from the laser plasma display painted lines across his tired face. The viewport beyond still showed the Saracen vessel dangling in the tether's grip, hull groaning in slow shudders. Calder didn't turn. He let the sight burn into him. "They laughed at us," Calder said. "They thought cutting a tether would make us panic. Now they've seen what happens when arrogance meets current. But if you think this ends with one trapped Scout, you're wrong. They'll bring more, and when they do, I want answers that hold up in blood, not equations." The command deck was warm, air recycled until it carried the faint sharpness of ion filters and the mustiness of canvas straps that had soaked sweat too many times. Crewmen shifted at their stations, harness buckles creaking, fingers tapping panels that hummed with data. Bram OK stood at the rear, a sheaf of marked pages in his hands. His knuckles were pale from clutching them. He stepped forward, each boot squeaking against the deck plating. "I've run their drive logs through analysis," he said. "The cut forced their coils into overload. They backed off because their own safeguards saved them from burning out. That's the lever we needed. Their strength is also their cage." Calder finally looked at him, eyes narrowing. "Show me the numbers, Bram, not the hope." OK nodded quickly and flicked a sequence onto the heads-up display. Graphs unrolled in sharp green waves, peaks rising, plunging, stabilizing again as the collars locked. "Induction surge at entry," OK explained, voice tightening with each word. "Superconducting lines can't bleed energy fast enough. Their coils choke themselves. They throttle down or they melt. That's not a guess. It's their own telemetry screaming it." He tapped the glass with his pen, the sound sharp against the backdrop of quiet machinery. Lorne's laugh crackled across comms from his tug, coarse and biting. "So we've got a leash for their dogs. Question is, can we drag a whole pack?" He coughed once, clearing his throat after hours breathing dry cabin air. "That cruiser went down easy because it didn't expect the trick. Next time they'll hit the line hard, 3, maybe 4 at once, and they won't wait to see what happens." His voice grew more gravelly. "You better tell me this net holds under a storm, Calder." Calder didn't flinch. He walked to the viewport, arms crossed behind his back, and stared at the fractured light running along the tethers, pulsing with redirected energy. "If it doesn't, then we've wasted every year tying rocks together, instead of building ships to match them. But this is what we have. We turn infrastructure into weaponry, or we let them cut it apart." His words carried across the deck, firm but even, not raised for effect, but sharpened by conviction. OK spread his pages on the console, ink smudged at the corners. He pointed at a diagram scribbled in black lines. "Project Foundry," he said, his tone quiet but clear. "Synchronize every driver on the chains. Unify fire into corridors. Guide debris instead of scattering it. That buys us time against missiles and drones. Meanwhile, tugs carry inductive collars into dormant stretches. We spread the net wider, make it impossible to approach without bleeding energy." His fingers shook as he pressed them against the paper, but his eyes did not waver. "We don't need to destroy their fleet. We just need to convince them that entering cislunar space means losing mobility. Price leaned forward, chin resting on his hand, his mouth twisted into a humorless smile. Convince them? These aren't diplomats. They'll burn crews by the thousand before they admit weakness. We need more than deterrence. We need proof. Capture another ship and they'll start believing physics, not words. He rapped his knuckles against the display, the sound hollow. I'll handle the fire corridors. You give me numbers I can trust, and I'll make their drone clouds look like confetti. Calder nodded once. Then it's settled. Foundry becomes priority. We weaponize the chains, and every man out there learns that our rocks aren't ornaments. They're traps. His gaze swept the crew, lingering on each officer, on the younger technicians whose hands twitched nervously on their controls. But before they fly blind into this, they need to hear why. Not statistics, not diagrams. They need to feel it. He tapped his comm to open a ship-wide channel. His voice carried across cabins, corridors, maintenance shafts where men tightened bolts with grease-stained fingers, and others lay strapped to bunks, staring at dull ceilings with hearts racing. You've heard them mock us, Calder began. They call our chains fragile, our stations toys, our lives disposable. You've seen their scouts carve through a line and leave us bleeding. But today we made one of their ships kneel. Not because we had more firepower, not because we outnumbered them, because we built something they don't understand. Every cable you bolted, every rock you drilled, every bolt you set, it wasn't wasted. It became the snare that trapped their arrogance. When they come again, they'll come harder, but so will we. You aren't workers anymore. You're defenders, and your hands are the reason this sky isn't theirs yet. The silence after the speech was heavier than the words. Calder pictured men glancing at one another, lips pressed tight, nodding without speaking. He closed the channel and looked at OK. Get me the models for triple load. If they come in waves, I want to know how much surge we can force through before our own lines break. OK rubbed his forehead, leaving a faint streak of graphite. I'll have it, he said softly. But Calder, the margin isn't infinite. We're playing with forces that can tear the Ark apart if mistimed. Calder's eyes flicked back to the scout pinned outside, its hull trembling against the tether's grip. Then we don't miss time. We get it right the first time. The room smelled of stale rations heating in a side galley, mixed with the dry tang of lubricant from maintenance gear stacked along the walls. The lights buzzed faintly as systems drew power. Outside, sparks danced where tugs repaired minor stress fractures. The site was both fragile and defiant, men patching the line while an empire waited just beyond orbital reach. Price finally broke the silence, voice low but steady. We've set the hook. Now the question is whether we can land what we've caught. His fingers tapped restlessly against the console, the rhythm sharp against the background hum of air circulation. Because when they realize we've turned their strength against them, they won't laugh anymore. They'll come to crush us. Calder turned away from the viewport, the glow of the laser plasma display catching the lines on his face. His jaw tightened. Then let them come. This time, we're ready to teach physics a language they can't dismiss. Contact in Corridor 12, Nolan Price barked, his fingers stabbing at the glowing red icon on the laser plasma display. They're not probing this time. They're charging head first. The command deck stiffened as alarms rippled through the stations. Calder pushed himself from his chair, his shoulders squared as he leaned toward the viewport. Beyond the reinforced glass, streaks of light marked where the chain pulsed, the tether lines alive with stored current. A Saracen cruiser had broken from formation, its drives flaring, throwing out a trail of blinding exhaust. The hull glinted in cruel arcs as if daring the net to close. Lorne, collars ready? Calder snapped into the comm. The tug pilot's voice came back, strained but controlled. Collars armed. My crew's strapped in. We're waiting for the surge window. Behind his words came the muffled clang of tools locked into brackets and the clatter of hands gripping harness straps. Sweat ran into his eyes, salty and stinging, but his focus did not waver. Bram Oakey lifted his head from the numbers spread across his bench. His eyes were rimmed red from hours without sleep. The envelope is charged, he said, his tone clipped, his body stiff as a wire. Their coils will choke in 3, 2. The display spiked. A ripple shuddered through the tether. the floor vibrating beneath every boot. Sparks cracked from an overloaded junction box, showering the technicians with heat and acrid smoke from burning. Insulation. Men coughed, eyes watering, but no one left their posts. "Now!" Calder thundered. The command exploded into motion. Lorne's tug shot forward, clamps groaning as he locked the collar onto the cruiser's hull. The impact rattled his cockpit, his teeth slamming together with a painful click. He winced, then bared them in a grin that no one could see. "She's fighting me, but the leash is on," he growled. The chain pulled, the tether lines groaning like stressed timber. The cruiser's drive sputtered again, then faltered as power bled away into currents it could not master. The deck smelled of scorched wiring and sweat-soaked uniforms. Calder gripped the rail, his knuckles whitening. "Hold it, Lorne!" Price covered the tug. The fire control officer was already moving. "On it," Price replied, his voice quick and edged with satisfaction. He slammed a firing command, and the rails thudded deep through the station's frame. Countermass slugs streaked outward, intercepting incoming drones that buzzed like hornets around the captured cruiser. Flashes lit the black as fragments scattered, tinkling against the viewport like hail. OK's words came clipped and urgent. "Load is high. If they push again, we risk a snap." Calder's jaw locked. He remembered the folder against his knee, his brother's name on a casualty sheet. He would not see another tether break on his watch. "Redistribute through the secondary lines," he ordered. "Bleed the strain into Arc 9. OK's hands flew across the panel, rerouting energy, sweat dripping from his brow onto the paper still spread before him. Inside the tug, Lorne's breathing rasped in his headset, each inhale ragged. "Calder, she's thrashing." "Feels like wrestling a bear." The hull of the cruiser shivered violently, vibrations rattling through the collar into his bones. His helmet's padding bit into his jaw, the pressure aching. He blinked through stinging eyes as the cruiser's lights flickered, their glow dimming, surrendering to the tether's will. "Steady, Lorne." Calder's voice cut like a blade, calm and unyielding. "You've got her." Silence followed. Then Lorne chuckled hoarsely. "Aye, she's in the cage." The captured cruiser drifted, its drives muted, its crew silent on open channels. The chain held, every tether alive with redirected power. The command deck exhaled as one. The sharp scent of sweat mixed with burnt insulation hung in the air, stinging nostrils and throats. Price rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, smearing grime across his cheek. "Second ship down," he said. "That's not luck anymore." "That's physics." Calder stepped forward, his reflection stark in the viewport glass. The sight of the immobilized cruiser, held like prey within a hunter's grip, sent a chill through the men who watched beside him. "Transmit the data to every station on the Ark," he ordered. "Let them see it with their own eyes. Tell them capture is not theory, it is fact." His voice carried the weight of a vow. "And tell the collective that if they want to enter this sky, they will do so as prisoners." The deck crew shifted, glancing at one another, the enormity settling in. They had turned infrastructure into weapon, and the empire that mocked them had now seen their own strength turned against them. The air tasted of iron and oil, bitter yet grounding, a reminder of the machines that made survival possible. Calder stood motionless, eyes hard, as the captured cruiser's beacon blinked on the display. But even in victory, unease lingered. OK's quiet voice cut through. "They'll come again," he murmured, barely above a whisper, though every man heard. "And when they do, it won't be one ship." Calder didn't reply immediately. He simply kept watching the immobilized vessel, his breath slow, steady, his eyes calculating. Then he turned, his words calm but sharp. "Then we prepare for a storm." This was only the net tightening. "Next time, we'll need to hold the line against the weight of their pride." "They're massing carriers on the outer arc," Nolan Price said, his voice rasping like gravel dragged across steel. The laser plasma display stretched the entire wall, flooded with red markers multiplying by the second. Each symbol represented a hull bristling with weapons, larger than the cruisers they had already netted. The air inside the command deck felt thick, heavy with the scent of heated wiring and stale breath from men who hadn't left their posts for days. Calder leaned closer, one palm pressed against the glass, his reflection a stark silhouette. "The scissor run," he muttered. "They're going to cut us apart in one stroke." Bram Oke shuffled forward, clutching a battered folder under his arm. His eyes were hollow, but his words came steady. "If they time it right, 3 cuts at once will overload bypass capacity. They don't need to break the whole chain, just enough to collapse the structure. Every station between will drift into chaos. It's efficient and brutal." His hands trembled as he spread diagrams across the console, pages smudged with graphite. "The models show we can absorb 2 simultaneous hits, but not 3. That's the line." Deke Lorne's voice broke through the calm, roughened by exhaustion but edged with fire. "So what? We throw up our hands. I didn't sign on to be a bystander while they carve the sky. Give me clearance, Calder, and I'll put my tugs in their faces. I'll ram them if I have to." The sound of his gloved fist striking his console echoed through the channel. "You tell me where to drive, and I'll drag them off course." Calder shook his head, though the anger in Lorne's tone mirrored his own. "If you ram, you die, and we lose the only crews who can anchor collars under fire. They want us reckless. We'll give them calculation." He turned to, "Okay. Options." Oke's voice tightened. "Drop lock. We detach habitats and use them as counterweights. Preload the tethers with mass, force the carriers into corridors they can't escape." He hesitated, his throat dry. "But the strain will crack Orchid. It's already brittle from years of stress fractures. If we call on it, the station won't survive." The words hung in the air like an execution order, waiting for a signature. Silence cloaked the deck. Men shifted uneasily, the air filled with the faint squeak of boots against the floor, the hiss of ventilation pushing recycled air into lungs that ached with anticipation. Price broke it, his voice colder than before. "Orchid was one of the first. Half the men here cut their teeth bolting its girders. If we shatter it, morale will bleed with it." Calder closed his eyes for a moment. In the dark, he saw his brother's face, smudged with grease, grinning in the old photo he carried. The smile had been frozen the day a tether had collapsed, leaving nothing but bent steel and silence. Calder opened his eyes, steel hard again. "Better one fracture we control than a collapse that takes us all. Evacuate Orchid. Seed demolition charges in its hull. If the flagship tries to break the corridor, we split it on our terms." The order sent ripples through the men. A technician swore under his breath. Others stared at their consoles as if the numbers might change by will alone. Lorne's voice came back, softer now, though still edged with heat. "I'll move the crews myself. They'll hate it, but they'll go if I tell them it's Calder's command." He paused, then added almost grudgingly, "You better make their sacrifice count." "Every bolt will count," Calder said firmly. His tone was flat, but his chest ached with the weight of the decision. He straightened, scanning the glowing map where enemy icons crept closer. "Price, bring Foundry online. Shape debris into corridors and scatter their drones before they reach the lines. Lorne, deploy collars into dormant stretches." "Okay, you're with me on the load models. If Orchid breaks, I want it to drag something valuable with it." The station trembled as power surged through the chains, energy coursing down tethers in shimmering pulses. Outside, sparks sprayed where men welded braces against Orchid's skin, their suits clinging to lines while torches hissed in arcs of blue. Inside, families were pulled from compartments with little warning. Voices echoed down corridors, curses, questions, the scrape of boots against steel ladders, the thud of crates being dragged into tugs. The taste of sweat and dust filled every breath as men abandoned the place they had called home. Calder walked those corridors himself, boots striking against deck plates, the cries of evacuees a drumbeat around him. A boy barely out of training clutched a wrench, eyes wide. "Sir, it doesn't have to die. Orchid's been here since the start." Calder met his gaze, his voice firm but not unkind. "Orchid's strength is ending this fight. Don't think of it as loss. Think of it as the stone we throw to stop their blade." The boy swallowed hard, nodded once, and let the wrench fall. Back on the command deck, the air was hot and close. Sweat ran down spines, uniforms clung to backs, hands slipped against consoles. The smell of lubricant and scorched insulation stung every nose. Calder took his place at the center, watching as the enemy formation spread wider, their carriers lining up like blades ready to shear. Price's voice came clipped, each word like a hammer striking metal. Mass drivers armed, trajectories locked. Give the word. Calder's throat felt raw, but his voice did not shake. Hold fire until they cross the corridor. Make them believe the path is open, then show them what happens when you underestimate chains. The carriers advanced, their lights cold, their flanks bristling with drones that glimmered like angry sparks. The tether lines glowed brighter, currents swelling in anticipation. Every man on the deck held his breath, the taste of copper thick on tongues bitten in tension. Calder's hand hovered over the command rail, not trembling, not rushing. He waited. When the first carrier pierced the corridor, the alarms blared, red spilling across the display. Calder's voice cracked across the silence. Now! Detonate the braces when I give the order, Boss Calder commanded, his voice cutting through the heated air of the command deck. The laser plasma displays rippled with enemy signatures, streaking into the corridor, their formation broad and deliberate. Every man present knew what that meant. The carriers were committing, intent on cutting through with overwhelming weight. Calder's throat felt dry, the taste of iron clinging as though he had bitten his own tongue, but he kept his tone level. If they force the passage, Orchid must split. This isn't about saving stone. It's about saving the chain. Bram Oak stood beside him, shoulders rigid, jaw tight. His hands gripped the railing until the knuckles whitened, yet his voice remained steady. The stress will cascade once the flagship enters. Orchid's fractures will spread in less than a minute. We either control the rupture or let the tether shear uncontrolled. He paused, then turned his eyes toward Calder. You already knew that when you signed the order. I just need you to say it out loud. Calder inhaled slowly, the air hot with the odor of scorched insulation from a fried panel near the wall. Yes, he said firmly. I knew. The word carried more weight than the deck itself. On the outer ring, evacuation crews pushed men through narrow corridors lit with flashing amber. The sound of boots striking against steel echoed like drums of retreat. Crates banged against bulkheads, shouted orders collided with curses. The acrid bite of spent extinguishers lingered in the lungs. A welder sealed the last hatch, his torch throwing sparks that sprayed across his visor, before he was pulled back toward the waiting tug. For those who had built their lives on Orchid's girders, leaving felt like ripping flesh from bone. In his tug cockpit, Deke Lorne's voice grated through the channel. Calder, cruiser clear. Orchid's compartments are empty. Aside from the charges, I'm keeping 3 tugs near her skin, ready to steady fragments when she goes. His words carried the fatigue of days awake, yet no tremor of doubt. Tell me when, and we'll hold the leash tight. On the display, the Sirican flagship thundered into view, dwarfing the other carriers in its shadow. Its hull gleamed like a blade dipped in oil, bristling with drone racks that flickered open. Missiles jetted forth, trails carving arcs of white against the dark. Price, Calder said sharply. I see them, Nolan Price answered, his fingers slamming across the fire control array. Foundry's drivers boomed, the sound deep in the bones, flinging counter mass in intersecting lines. Explosions bloomed outside, clouds of fragmented rock and shredded drones sparkling like cruel fireworks. The deck rattled beneath their feet, ceiling panels quivering as bolts strained. Price wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. That bought us seconds. Nothing more. The flagship entered the charged corridor, its drives roaring bright. OK's monitors spiked as currents surged through its coils. Envelope breach, he shouted. They're throttling down but pushing harder than the Scout ever did. Stress levels climbing. His throat bobbed, voice turning raw. If Orchid doesn't break now, the whole chain will. Calder pressed a hand against the console. The cool surface steadied him. Lorne, prepare. I'm ready, came the reply, low and steady, like a man bracing to pull a trigger he never wanted to touch. Calder's chest tightened as he lifted his hand. Execute drop lock. Split Orchid. The deck jolted as demolition charges ignited. A tremor ran through the tether like a beast tearing itself apart. Men grabbed rails, their stomachs lurching as alarms wailed. Outside, Orchid shuddered, fractures spreading across its surface in bright webs. A roar filled the comms as entire sections broke loose, cascading into two massive fragments tethered by emergency lines. Dust and shards sprayed outward, coating the viewport in a haze that sparkled against distant light. Inside his tug, Lorne cursed through clenched teeth, jerking the controls as fragments drifted. "Steady, damn you!" "Steady!" His arms ached, sweat burning his eyes as the harness cut into his chest. His crew groaned under strain, their hands blistered from gripping controls, their breath ragged inside helmets fogged with condensation. With a heave, they stabilized the largest fragment, the tether groaning but holding. The flagship struck the shifted geometry, its momentum met the drag of fractured mass, and the great vessel lurched, drives sputtering, coils lit with arcs, energy bleeding into lines it couldn't escape. The entire ship seemed to shiver as though a giant's hand had seized it by the spine. Price exhaled a harsh laugh. "Caught!" She's bleeding thrust like a gut-shot animal. The command deck erupted in voices, cheers, cries, gasps. But Calder raised his hand, cutting them short. "It's not over. Hold the line." His own heart pounded. The copper taste thick in his mouth, but his voice remained iron. The flagship's commander tried to break free, venting propellant in plumes. The maneuver twisted the ship, but only deepened the strain. OK's readings shot higher. "They're cooking themselves. Another 30 seconds and their coils will be beyond recovery." Calder clenched his fist, his knuckles pressed white against the rail. He spoke not to the deck, but to the men straining in their tugs, to those who had built Orchid, to the memory of his brother. "Every sacrifice matters now. Hold them. Make Orchid's death our shield." The flagship's glow dimmed as drives faltered, the once proud vessel dragged into the chain's grip. Its weapons sputtered, unable to feed power through fried circuits. The corridor cleared of missiles, their launchers silent. The Serecan pride, their towering blade, had been blunted by the stone they had mocked. Silence fell over the deck, broken only by the hiss of filters and the creak of stressed braces. Price leaned back, chest heaving, and let out a hoarse laugh. "They mocked our rocks. Now they orbit our chains." Calder did not smile. He simply lowered his hand, his gaze locked on the fragments of Orchid drifting alongside the tether. The dust cloud shimmered, a funeral shroud spread across the sky. His chest burned with grief, but beneath it lay something harder, forged from loss into resolve. "Signal the arc," he said quietly. Orchid held. "Tell them we'll endure, no matter the cost." Men across the deck bowed their heads, some whispering prayers, others clenching fists. The taste of ash lingered in their mouths. The sting of salt burned in their eyes, the heat of battle still pressed against their skin. They had sacrificed a station, but in doing so, they had chained an empire's flagship. And in that moment, the weight of their defiance bound them tighter than steel. "Multiple carriers breaching corridor vectors," Nolan Price shouted, his words riding over the deep vibration that rattled through the deck supports. The laser plasma displays lit the room in harsh crimson, painting every face in tones of blood. Enemy icons surged forward in disciplined lines, larger than anything they had fought so far. Calder stood rigid at the center, eyes locked on the storm descending. His hand pressed firmly against the command rail, as if anchoring himself to the entire chain. "This is the strike we've been waiting for," he said, voice low but steady. "Make every tether count." Outside, the carriers spilled drones in swarms, thousands of glittering shapes moving like a tidal wave across the void. Explosions from their opening salvo slammed against the chain's defensive barriers. The flashes cast harsh strobe light shadows across the command deck, making every man's expression fierce and strained. The air smelled of sweat and burnt insulation from an overworked relay. The metallic tang of blood lingered where a technician had bitten his lip during the last jolt. "Foundry corridors armed," Price called, fingers darting over the fire control panel. His back muscles knotted beneath his uniform, His jaw clenched until it creaked. He triggered the mass drivers and the station roared with thunder. Streams of countermass tore into the drone cloud, shredding lines, scattering wings, filling the black with glittering wreckage that spun like falling stars. That clears the first layer, he snarled. But they're still coming. Bram Oak leaned over his console, pupils dilated as numbers climbed beyond safety. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with exertion, his voice clipped and urgent. Load at Corridor 17 is exceeding design. If they push another cruiser through, the tether could snap. His pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against the floor. He didn't reach for it. His eyes never left the screen. Calder turned to comms. Lorne, bring your tugs into the corridor. Collars only on my mark. If you try to leash early, you'll be dragged under. On the far flank, Deke Lorne's voice growled through static. My crews are braced, Calder. They've seen Orchid split. They know the cost. We'll hold, whatever it takes behind him. Muffled voices shouted commands. The slap of gloved hands against bulkheads. The groan of clamps locking down. His tug shuddered as another shock wave rippled through the chain, rattling his teeth until he tasted copper. He spat into a rag and shoved it aside. Give us something to fight, and we'll tear it down. The flagship, already ensnared from Orchid's sacrifice, drifted powerless nearby. Its once proud hull now a warning beacon. The sight drove the other carriers to fury. They surged harder, their drives blazing. The chains answered with current pulses, their tether lines glowing like veins under strain. Sparks danced along the decks as overloads snapped relays, and technicians scrambled with tools, the sting of hot metal burning their fingers. Missile wave incoming, Price barked. Alarms screeched, red symbols filling the display. He clenched his teeth, slammed firing controls, and the drivers spat another storm. Explosions bloomed, tearing through the missiles before they reached impact range. Still, some slipped through, slamming against defensive plating. The station rocked, men thrown against consoles, cries filling the deck. One officer rose clutching a bleeding forehead, blood dripping down his nose, but he refused to leave his post. Calder steadied himself, chest heaving. He locked eyes with OK, who shook his head slightly. It won't hold much longer, OK said hoarsely. We're bleeding strength across too many nodes. Physics has limits. Calder's reply was iron. So do they. Make them meet theirs before we reach ours. The largest carrier entered Corridor 17. The tether shrieked as stress climbed, a deep groan running through the hull that made stomachs clench. Now, Lorne, Calder roared. Lorne drove his tug forward, eyes burning as his collar jaws spread open. Steady, boys, he bellowed, his crew grunting as the ship shuddered beneath their hands. The collar slammed shut across the carrier's flank, the impact rattling every bone in his body. He gasped, vision blurring, but held the controls with white-knuckled strength. We've got her! The carrier thrashed, drives blazing, but the chain drank its momentum. The tether lines glowed brighter, current forcing through, sparks bursting in arcs along relay junctions. Technicians screamed warnings as compartments filled with smoke, eyes stinging, throats raw. Men coughed but stayed at their posts, fingers flying across panels slick with sweat. Price laughed through clenched teeth, eyes wild as more drones fell under his barrage. Two caught! 2 damn carriers on the leash. His hands shook, muscles quivering from strain, yet he fired again and again, the rails thundering like a hammer against the night. OK clutched the console, his face pale, lips dry. Load redistribution failing, he muttered. His knees buckled, but he forced himself upright. We'll lose Arc 9 unless we bleed it into Arc 4. Do it, Calder commanded without hesitation. Better bruises than death. The reroute slammed into Arc 4, the entire station buckling. Men screamed as they were hurled against rails. A panel burst, sparks spraying across the deck, the stink of burned plastic filling the air. A hand reached for a fire suppressant, foam spraying white across the flames, hissing as it smothered the blaze. The taste of it clung, bitter on tongues. Outside, the captured carriers strained, their lights flickering, their coils screaming with energy they could not shed. The chain held them, dragging them deeper into orbits dictated by Earth's grip. The crews inside must have felt their pride disintegrating, their mighty vessels reduced to prey, but their silence was total. Calder straightened, his chest burning from the smoke. "Transmit across the arc," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Tell every station that Orchid's sacrifice was not in vain. Tell them the chains hold." The deck went quiet, men catching their breath, sweat streaking their faces, uniforms clinging with damp heat. They had fought off a storm and bound enemy carriers into the leash of their own creation. The air was heavy with exhaustion, the bitter taste of blood and smoke lingering on every tongue. But above all, there was the realization that against all odds, the chains still stood. "Get anchors on their hulls before they remember how to fight," Voss Calder ordered, his voice raw but unwavering. The laser plasma displays flickered with captured icons, carriers that only hours earlier had been poised to cut Earth's lifeline. Now they drifted in cislunar orbit, tethered by currents they could not resist, their drives fried and their drone racks silenced. The command deck smelled of scorched circuits and sweat-damp uniforms, the air thick with the sting of smoke that had not yet cleared. Deke Lorne's tug squadron moved first. His voice carried the fatigue of a man stretched to breaking, yet iron still threaded through each syllable. "Anchors deployed," he growled into comms. "Collars tightened, lines feeding straight into the chain. These beasts are leashed for good." His tug rattled as clamps locked into the nearest carrier's flank. Sparks showered his canopy, burning bright before vanishing into black. Inside the cabin, straps dug into his chest, every rib aching from the strain of the earlier maneuvers. He spat into a rag, coughed, then added, "They're ours, Calder." "They won't move without our say." Bram OK hovered over his console, lips moving as if reciting a litany. The glow of graphs reflected off his hollow eyes. "Energy drain stable," he murmured. His hand trembled as it dragged across numbers, sweat dripping from his brow onto the pages scattered before him. "Their coils can't recover. They're too deep in the field. They're not ships anymore, they're weights." His throat tightened as he said it, not in triumph, but in awe at the sheer finality of it. Nolan Price barked from fire control, his voice hoarse but triumphant. "Foundry's guns are cold now but still trained. If they twitch, I'll light them up." He leaned back, exhaustion carving lines into his face. The smell of burnt insulation clung to his uniform. His hand rested on the console, tapping slowly, almost tenderly, as though feeling the heartbeat of the system that had carried them through. "We've chained their pride to our rocks, Calder. Doesn't matter how big their hulls are, physics doesn't bargain." Calder's gaze lingered on the viewport, where the crippled carriers hung in orbit like trophies no one wanted to celebrate too loudly. The glow of their fractured drives bled into the black, dim and sickly. Men on the deck stared, some with open awe, others with expressions grim as funerals. Calder's chest burned with grief for Orchid's loss, yet beneath it ran a current of cold satisfaction. "Send the transmission," he said. His voice filled the deck like a hammer on an anvil. "Every station, every outpost. Tell them the chains held. Tell them Orchid's sacrifice has bound an empire." The message rippled across. The network men in maintenance bays stopped to listen, grease still on their hands, eyes wet. Tug crews paused mid-flight, gripping their joysticks tighter. In the dark cabins of orbital relays, men slumped against walls, exhaustion breaking into hoarse cheers. Even the silence of those who had seen too much held weight. They nodded once, their grief stitched together with pride. The captured flagship loomed larger than the rest, still glowing faintly from the strain of being pulled into orbit. Its surface bore scars where the collar had locked tight, where its pride had been stripped away. Calder fixed his gaze on it. "We'll mark it," he said quietly. "Memorial plates, every name from Orchid, welded to their hull so they never forget what it cost us." His voice deepened. "And so we never forget what we paid." OK looked up, his face pale but resolute. "A tomb in orbit," he said. "They'll see it every time they look at their own captured ship." A warning carved in steel. Calder nodded once. "Exactly that." Negotiations began before the smoke had cleared. Signals from the Saracen fleet trickled through, cold voices stripped of arrogance. They asked for conditions, for terms of survival. Price sneered at the sound of them, leaning over his console. Funny how quick they learn manners when their claws are broken. His tone carried the bite of bitterness, but Calder's expression remained unreadable. Their commanders will accept anchors on every hull entering Earth-Moon space, Calder declared. They'll submit to chain schedules, stay under our fire control until departure. If they want trade, if they want passage, they'll orbit our leash. Nothing moves without our blessing. His words rang with finality. Lorne cut in from his tug, voice weary but certain. And if they refuse? Calder's eyes never left the captured flagship. Then they'll watch their fleet rot in orbit, powerless, until their empire learns that chains don't break. The command deck went still. Men felt the truth in his words, heavy as stone. The taste of copper still lingered in their mouths, the sting of smoke in their lungs, the ache of muscles that had fought beyond endurance. Yet in that silence, pride settled like iron. Okay, broke it softly. We've rewritten the rules, Voss. Not with new weapons, but with what we built for life. Our stones became their prison. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out. They'll never mock them again. Calder's chest tightened, his brother's face flickering in memory. The old photograph he carried still folded in his pocket. He exhaled, long and slow. Send the doctrine update to Earth. Let every council know. We've chained carriers to our sky, and from this day forward, no empire laughs at tiny planets. Men on the deck bowed their heads, some whispering the names of the fallen. Outside, the carriers drifted silently in their new orbits, tethered by lines. They could never escape. Their glow dimmed, their pride reduced to weight. And around them the chains pulsed steady, guardians of a world that had turned its weakness into the very snare that bound its enemies. Transmit the terms, Voss Calder said, his voice carrying across the weary command deck like the strike of iron on iron. Officers leaned closer, their faces marked by smoke, blood, and exhaustion. The captured carriers floated in obedient orbits beyond the viewport, their lights dimmed, their weapons cold, their prides shackled to Earth's chains. The air tasted stale, heavy with the tang of sweat and foam suppressant. The quiet buzz of power relays was the only reminder that systems still lived beneath the battered skin of the station. Calder's gaze hardened. Every ship under their banner that enters this sky will anchor to our schedules. They will submit to our control or watch their crews rot alongside those husks outside. Bramoke turned toward him, his hands still smudged with graphite from load maps that had predicted disaster. His voice was hoarse but firm. And if they send reinforcements? If the collective decides humiliation is worse than loss? His question was not defiance, but a reflection of the fear running silently through every man present. Calder did not avert his eyes from the viewport. Then reinforcements will arrive to find their own flagships leashed, anchors on their drives, memorial plates on their hulls. If they break through, they inherit nothing but dust. If they stay, they orbit our leash. Either way, the doctrine is written. He looked back at OK, his words deliberate. We turned our weakness into the cage that holds them. That lesson spreads further than their pride. Deke Lorne's voice filled the calm, raw and weary. Crews are welding plates now, every name from Orchid etched into steel. I'm watching sparks fly across their hulls. Looks like fireflies clinging to a beast's skin. The Saracen crews can't look away. They know they're bound to our dead as much as to our chains. He coughed, spat, then forced out another sentence. I've never seen my men so silent. Even the loud ones keep their voices down, like they're standing in a church. Nolan Price shifted at fire control, leaning heavily against the console. His face was streaked with grime, his knuckles raw from striking panels when stress peaked earlier. Their commanders already sent an acknowledgement. They want their crews spared and their ships returned once repairs are made. His lips curled in a bitter half-smile. They won't get either. These aren't ships anymore. They're monuments. Every orbit they complete under our watch is a reminder of who writes the laws here. Calder moved closer, his boots scraping across the deck. He placed a hand flat against the cold glass of the viewport. The captured flagship loomed largest, its collar still locked tight, its drives dead. The fragments of Orchid drifted nearby, tethered in solemn silence, dust trailing like a shroud. His reflection stared back at him, lined, hollow-eyed, but unbroken. We built these chains for life, not war. But war came, and they became more than lifelines. They became proof that infrastructure is power when wielded with will. His throat tightened as memory struck. The accident file, his brother's name scrawled across the casualty list, the photo folded and carried in his pocket. He pressed harder against the glass. I swore no collapse would go unanswered again. Today, that promise held OK lowered himself into a chair, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. History will mark this day. Not as the time Earth won a fleet action, but when we rewrote doctrine with cables and stones. They'll teach it in their academies. Warnings painted as lessons. Tethered worlds cannot be taken by force. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, leaving streaks of dirt across his cheek. And still, they'll never understand the cost we paid. Price snorted, though it lacked humor. Let them struggle to understand. Let them explain to their own admirals why their carriers circle our sky like chained beasts. He leaned forward, his voice softening into something close to reverence. Every orbit they complete is an admission they were wrong. That's punishment enough. Calder turned his head slowly, taking in each man. Price with his hardened grin, OK with his trembling hands. The silent technicians whose eyes glistened in the glow of battered consoles. We will not gloat, he said firmly. We will not spit on the defeated. We will weld our names to their hulls and let the orbit speak. Every revolution they make is testimony. Earth held against empire. The chains are not toys. They are our doctrine. And from this day forward, they are law. Messages from the collective streamed across comms. Pleas for mercy, demands for negotiation, desperate promises. Calder allowed them to queue unanswered. Their words meant nothing now. Their ships spoke louder. The doctrine was already spreading beyond this system. Traders who had watched from the sidelines transmitted the images outward. Carriers shackled, chains glowing, Orchid's fragments drifting as eternal witnesses. By the time the collective council received the news, the galaxy would already know. Lorne's final transmission came through, his voice ragged but proud. Anchors sealed, plates welded. The flagship bears Orchid's names now, every letter shining under the work lights. The Serican officers bowed their heads when the sparks rained over them. They understand, even if they'll never admit it. His tone softened, almost a whisper. I think Orchid's people would have been proud. Calder closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them again. Signal Earth, he ordered. Tell the councils. Tell every colony. The doctrine of the chains is born. From now on, when they mock our tiny planets, remind them their fleets orbit our stones. His words were quiet, but the silence they left in their wake was immense. The command deck settled into stillness, broken only by the faint hiss of air filters and the distant clang of welders finishing their work outside. The men who remained at their posts leaned back, exhausted beyond measure, but their expressions carried something new. Not just survival, but ownership of a future wrestled from despair. Calder remained at the viewport, his hand still pressed against the glass, his eyes locked on the carriers now circling Earth's leash. His brother's memory was with him, etched into the chain of names, but so was the living testament outside. Beyond the station, the captured fleet continued its slow rotation. Every orbit stitched the doctrine tighter into history. What began as mockery, tiny planets, had ended with an empire's pride dragged into Earth's gravity well, bound by human engineering and sacrifice. The chains gleamed steady in the dark, carrying power, memory, and a warning no admiral could ignore. And Calder, standing with smoke still in his lungs and grief still lodged in his chest, knew the war was finished. Not because they had destroyed their enemy, but because they had forced them to circle forever around the stones they once ridiculed. If this story gripped you, hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY tales where humanity turns the tables on empires. Now we want to hear from you. If Earth's chains were yours to command, which enemy fleet would you bind into orbit as a warning to the galaxy? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where strategy turns weakness into victory. See you in the next story.